The memo was marked with the highest security level, 3 lines of text, no signature, just coordinates in the Nevada desert, and a single instruction: get there within the hour. For the men who received it, this was not their first mission. They had trained for years. They practiced procedures that officially did not exist. They signed documents that made them legally invisible. Their mission was simple on paper, but scary in practice. Get the object, lock down the site, leave no trace. What they found in those desert wastes would challenge everything they thought they knew. Their work, their government, and the universe itself would never look the same. The American Southwest has always been a place of secrets. Vast stretches of empty land, military bases hidden behind mountain ranges, skies so clear that anything unusual becomes visible right away. During the Second World War, the region became a testing ground for weapons that would shape the modern world. The Manhattan Project ran its first atomic test at the Trinity site in New Mexico. Bombers practiced runs over empty landscapes that looked like enemy territory. By the time the war ended, the military had claimed huge sections of desert as restricted zones. The public was told this was needed for national security. What they were not told was how much of that security dealt with events that had nothing to do with human technology. In July of 1947, something crashed near Roswell, New Mexico. The first press release from the Roswell Army Airfield said that personnel had recovered a flying disc. Hours later, a second statement claimed it was merely a weather balloon. This flip sparked decades of questions. But what most people do not know is that Roswell was not alone. Reports of unusual crashes and recoveries had been happening across the desert Southwest for years. Military personnel were already familiar with procedures for dealing with wreckage that did not match any known aircraft. By the time Roswell made headlines, recovery teams had been working in secret for at least 2 years. The origins of these teams remain unclear. Some researchers trace them back to a classified operation set up in 1945. This was shortly after reports of strange aerial events began flooding military channels. Pilots returning from missions over the Pacific described objects that paced their aircraft. These objects made impossible turns. They disappeared at speeds no human technology could reach. At first, the military thought these were new Japanese or German weapons. When the war ended and the reports continued, a different explanation was needed. Someone high up in the chain of command decided something important. If these objects were real, and if they ever came down, the United States needed to collect them before anyone else did. The first documented recovery happened in the spring of 1947. This was months before Roswell. A rancher in the mountains north of Albuquerque reported seeing a bright object streak across the sky. It impacted somewhere in the high desert. He called the local sheriff. The sheriff contacted the nearest military base. Within hours, a team arrived by truck. They blocked off the area. They collected fragments of metal debris. They left before sunrise. The rancher was told he had seen an experimental aircraft. He was told not to discuss it. He agreed. But years later, on his deathbed, he told his grandson about the material he had briefly touched before the soldiers took it away. It was lighter than aluminum but stronger than steel. When bent, it returned to its original shape. He had never seen anything like it. After Roswell, these operations happened more often. Reports came in from Arizona, Nevada, California, and Texas. Not all of them involved crashes. Some were described as controlled landings, as if the craft had deliberately set down in remote locations. Others left scorch marks hundreds of feet long. This suggested terrible failures. The military responded with a level of planning that showed extensive preparation. Transport planes were sent out. Entire crash sites were dug up and removed. Witnesses were interviewed, sometimes multiple times. Their stories were guided until they matched official explanations. The public heard about weather balloons and classified aircraft tests. The teams doing the actual work knew better. One member of these recovery units spoke anonymously to a researcher in the 1980s. He described the standard procedure. First, The site was found using coordinates from radar stations or civilian reports. A boundary was set up, often under the cover of a military training exercise or hazardous material spill. Civilians were turned away. Local law enforcement was told to redirect traffic. Then came the recovery itself. Teams would photograph everything. They catalogued debris. They carefully pulled out pieces of the wreckage. If the object was whole or partly whole, cranes and flatbed trucks were brought in. Everything was loaded and covered with tarps. It was moved under armed guard to secure facilities. The sites were then swept for any remaining traces. Soil samples were taken, radiation levels were checked. By the time the boundary was lifted, it looked as though nothing had ever happened. But not every recovery went smoothly. In 1952, a team was sent to the desert outside of Kingman, Arizona. This followed reports of a mid-air explosion. When they arrived, they found something they had not expected. The craft had not broken apart. It had landed, mostly whole, in a shallow canyon. The object was roughly oval, about 30 feet across. The hull appeared seamless. There were no visible rivets, no welded seams, nothing that suggested normal construction. One team member later described it as looking more grown than built, as if the entire structure had been formed from a single piece of material. The recovery took 3 days. Engineers were brought in to figure out how to move it without causing damage. Cutting torches had no effect on the hull. Hydraulic jacks barely lifted it. Eventually, they managed to load it onto a special trailer. They moved it to a facility in Nevada. What happened to it after that remains unknown, but the team members involved were moved to new posts shortly afterward. Several reported being followed in the months after the operation. Phone calls at odd hours. Cars parked outside their homes. They were reminded, in ways both quiet and direct, that their work was classified and would remain so. Not all of the objects recovered were empty. In at least 3 documented cases, teams reported finding occupants. The descriptions varied, but certain details stayed the same. The beings were small, typically between 3 and 4 feet tall. Their bodies were thin, they had slim limbs and large heads. Their eyes were big and dark, sometimes described as black, sometimes as reflective. In 2 of the incidents, the beings were already dead. In the third, one was reportedly alive but badly injured. That case happened in 1953 near the White Sands Missile Range. It became one of the most closely guarded secrets in the history of the recovery program. The team that responded found the craft partly buried in sand. It had clearly been there for some time, perhaps weeks. When they opened a hatch on the side, they discovered 2 bodies and 1 living occupant. The surviving being was moved to a secure medical facility. Military doctors tried to treat its injuries. Reports suggest it survived for several days before dying. During that time, it reportedly tried to communicate, but not through speech. Some personnel described a form of mental contact, images and emotions sent directly into their minds. Others dismissed this as stress and imagination. What is certain is that the being's death was followed by an immediate lockdown. Everyone involved was transferred. Documents related to the incident were classified at levels above top secret. Even mentioning it within certain military circles could end a career. The facilities where these objects and bodies were taken became the subject of intense questions. Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio was often mentioned. So was Area 51 in Nevada, though that name would not become widely known until decades later. Researchers who have tried to look into these locations have found themselves blocked at every turn. Records have been destroyed or reclassified. Personnel who worked there have refused to speak. Some claim to remember nothing. Yet enough fragments of information have leaked over the years to paint a disturbing picture. These were not simple storage warehouses. They were research centers. They were staffed by scientists and engineers. Their job was to understand technology that was far beyond anything humanity had achieved. One engineer worked at a facility in Nevada during the 1960s. He He later described examining a propulsion system recovered from a crash site. It had a series of interlocking parts. They seemed to control electromagnetic fields in ways that broke known physics. There were no fuel tanks, no exhaust, no obvious power source. When turned on, the device made a low hum. It created a faint distortion in the air around it, as if space itself was being bent. The engineer admitted he could not fully understand how it worked, only that it did. He spent months documenting its behavior. He wrote reports that were immediately classified and filed away. He never learned if his work led to any practical uses, though rumors of reverse engineering projects have spread for decades. The engineer, who identified himself only as Robert, later provided more details in a series of interviews conducted in the 1990s. He described the facility as unlike anything he had seen in his previous work for aerospace companies. The main laboratory was housed deep underground, accessible only by a freight elevator that descended for what felt like several minutes. The temperature remained constant regardless of the season above ground. The air had a recycled quality, sterile and slightly metallic. Security was extreme even by military standards. Robert underwent background checks that examined every aspect of his life going back to childhood. His family was interviewed, his friends, former teachers, even casual acquaintances were questioned. Once cleared, he was required to live on site for weeks at a time. No phone calls home, no letters, complete isolation from the outside world. He said this was not just for security, it was to prevent any outside influence from affecting their work, to keep their minds focused solely on the task at hand. The propulsion device he worked on was kept in a sealed chamber. The walls were lined with sensors measuring everything from electromagnetic radiation to gravitational fluctuations. The device itself was surprisingly small, about the size of a basketball, yet the energy readings it produced were off the charts. When activated, nearby equipment would malfunction. Lights would flicker, compasses would spin wildly. One time, a researcher's watch stopped working. When examined later, the internal mechanism had been fused together, as if exposed to intense heat, but the watch itself was cool to the touch. Robert described attempting to measure the device's weight. This proved impossible. The scale would show different readings each time. Sometimes it registered as 10 pounds, sometimes 50. Once it showed a negative number, as if the device was pushing away from the Earth rather than being pulled toward it. This defied everything he knew about physics, about gravity, about mass and weight. His reports documenting these anomalies were met with interest, but no explanation. His superiors simply told him to keep testing, to document everything. That understanding would come later. The other researchers at the facility were equally baffled. They came from top universities, from leading aerospace companies. These were not ordinary engineers and scientists. These were the best minds in their fields, yet none of them could explain what they were seeing. One physicist suggested the device was manipulating space-time itself, creating a bubble of altered physics around it. This would explain the weight fluctuations, the gravitational effects, but it was only a theory, one they could not test or prove with available technology. Robert also described the other objects stored at the facility, entire craft in various states of damage. Some looked almost intact, others were barely recognizable as having once been vehicles. He was shown one that had apparently been cut open. The interior was a maze of conduits and structures that seemed to serve no obvious purpose. There were no seats, no controls, no windows, just smooth surfaces and strange geometric patterns embedded in the walls. The material was unlike anything in the periodic table. When analyzed, it showed properties that should not exist: extreme hardness combined with flexibility, resistance to heat that exceeded any known alloy, the ability to conduct electricity without any measurable resistance. One day, Robert was shown what he was told was a piece of hull material. It was thin, almost like foil, but when he tried to cut it with a diamond saw, the blade broke. When heated with a torch, it remained cool to the touch. When struck with a hammer, it rang like a bell but showed no dent or deformation. The most disturbing property was its reaction to thought. Robert noticed that when he concentrated on the material, it seemed to change color slightly, from silver to a faint blue. When he stopped concentrating, it returned to silver. Other researchers reported the same phenomenon, as if the material was responding to human consciousness, to intention. This led to experiments that Robert found deeply unsettling. Researchers were asked to focus on specific thoughts while near the material, to imagine shapes, colors, actions. The material responded, not dramatically, but enough to be measured. It would warm slightly when someone thought about heat. It would cool when someone thought about cold. The implications were staggering. This suggested technology that interfaced directly with the mind, that could be controlled by thought alone. No buttons, no controls, just intention and response. The work at these facilities was not just about understanding the technology, it was about keeping it hidden. Security was extreme. Workers were divided into small groups. Each group only knew about their specific task. No one saw the big picture. Polygraph tests were common. Background checks went back generations. Even family members were investigated. The message was clear. This work was more than top secret. It was beyond classification. It existed in a space where normal rules did not apply. Robert left the program in 1968. He was never given a reason for his dismissal. One day, he was simply told his services were no longer required. He was debriefed for 3 days, made to sign additional secrecy documents, warned about the consequences of disclosure. Then he was driven to the nearest town and left there. No thank you, no explanation. He returned to civilian life but found himself unable to settle. The work haunted him. The questions it raised consumed his thoughts. For years he told no one. But as he grew older, as he watched technology advance in ways that seemed to echo what he had seen in that underground facility, he began to wonder if silence was the right choice. In his final years, he spoke to a handful of researchers, always carefully, always aware that speaking could bring consequences. But he felt the public deserved to know that the truth, whatever it was, should not die with him and others like him. Some of the scientists who worked on these projects later expressed regret, not about the work itself, but about the secrecy. One physicist, speaking decades after his involvement, said he believed the public had a right to know. He argued that the technology recovered could have advanced human civilization by centuries, clean energy, new materials, methods of travel that could take humanity to the stars. Instead, it sat in warehouses, studied by a handful of people, kept from the world out of fear of panic, fear of losing military advantage, fear of what it meant for humanity's place in the universe. By the 1970s, the recovery operations had become more advanced. Improvements in radar and satellite technology meant that unusual objects could be tracked with greater precision. Response times improved. Teams were sent out by helicopter rather than truck. This cut hours off the process. But the nature of the events seemed to change as well. Reports of crashes became less common. Sightings of whole craft increased. Some researchers have suggested that whoever or whatever was piloting these objects learned to avoid detection, or they improved their technology to reduce failures. Others believe the military simply became better at hiding information, making it harder for the public to learn about incidents. One event that nearly exposed the entire program happened in 1980. A glowing object was seen coming down near the Manzano weapons storage area in New Mexico. This was a facility where nuclear weapons were kept. Security personnel watched the object hovering over the storage bunkers for several minutes. Then it accelerated and disappeared. The incident was logged, looked into, and classified, but documents related to it were later released through a Freedom of Information Act request. They were heavily redacted but revealing enough to confirm that something had happened. The military's official explanation was that security personnel had misidentified a natural event. The guards who saw it disagreed, but by then they had learned that disagreeing publicly came with consequences. The Manzano incident was not unique. Throughout the 1980s and 90s, similar events occurred at other nuclear facilities. Objects were spotted near Malmstrom Air Force Base in Montana. Strange lights appeared over nuclear storage sites in England. In one case, missile systems temporarily went offline while an unknown craft hovered nearby. These incidents followed a pattern. The objects seemed drawn to places where nuclear weapons were stored or tested. Some researchers believe this was surveillance, an effort by whoever controlled these craft to monitor humanity's most dangerous technology. Others think it was a warning, a demonstration that our weapons, no matter how powerful, were no match for theirs. The recovery teams adapted to these new challenges. Protocols were updated, new equipment was developed, radiation suits became standard gear, Geiger counters were brought to every site. Teams trained for scenarios that included not just crashed objects, but active ones. What would they do if a craft landed and refused to leave? What if the occupants were hostile? These questions were never answered publicly, but the fact that they were being asked suggests the military was preparing for possibilities most people never considered. Training for these teams became increasingly sophisticated. By the 1980s, they were running simulations that bordered on science fiction. Mock crash sites were set up in remote desert areas, complete with fake debris that mimicked the properties of recovered materials. Teams practiced containment procedures, decontamination protocols, how to handle materials that might be radioactive or biologically hazardous, how to deal with curious civilians who might stumble upon a site. The scenarios grew more complex over time. What if the craft was still powered? What if it posed a risk of explosion? What if there were survivors who needed immediate medical attention? The teams trained with specially designed equipment, containers that could shield against unknown forms of radiation, suits that protected against biological hazards that might not even exist on Earth, medical kits designed for physiology that was purely theoretical. One retired team member described a training exercise that took place in 1987. The scenario involved a craft that had landed rather than crashed. It was intact and appeared operational. The team's objective was to secure the site and attempt communication with any occupants. They approached the mock craft using protocols developed over decades of actual recoveries. Hand signals rather than radio communication. Weapons drawn but pointed down. An attempt to appear non-threatening while maintaining readiness. The exercise included actors playing the role of extraterrestrial beings. They were instructed to react unpredictably, sometimes hostile, sometimes curious, sometimes completely unresponsive. The team had to adapt in real time, to make decisions with incomplete information, to balance the need for security with the possibility of first contact. The retired team member said the exercise was more psychologically demanding than any combat training he had experienced. The uncertainty, the weight of knowing that a single mistake could have consequences beyond imagination. These training programs were conducted at locations so remote that even the local population was unaware of their existence. Areas of the Nevada test site that were not marked on any map. Valleys in Arizona, accessible only by helicopter. The teams would deploy for weeks at a time, living in temporary camps, running scenarios day and night. The goal was to make their response automatic, to eliminate hesitation so that when a real event occurred, they would be ready. There were also psychological evaluations, regular sessions with military psychologists who held the highest clearances. These were not ordinary mental health checks. They were designed to assess how well team members were coping with the knowledge they carried, with the things they had seen. The psychologists looked for signs of obsession, of paranoia, of the kind of stress that could lead to someone breaking their silence. Those who showed warning signs were quietly reassigned. Given desk jobs far from the actual operations, the toll on relationships was significant. Team members could not explain their work to spouses or children, could not share why they disappeared for days or weeks at a time. Some marriages failed under the strain. Others survived only because partners learned not to ask questions, to accept the silences, the unexplained absences, the haunted looks that sometimes appeared without warning. Children of team members often sensed that something was different about their parents' work, that it was more than just classified military operations. Some grew up feeling a strange disconnect, knowing their father or mother carried secrets, but never knowing what those secrets were. A few, as adults, pursued careers in related fields, hoping to glimpse what their parents had seen. Most were turned away. The programs did not want families, did not want personal connections that could become vulnerabilities. As the decades passed, the culture of secrecy around these operations began to crack. If only slightly, whistleblowers came forward. Though often only after retiring or reaching the end of their careers, some spoke at UFO conferences. They shared stories that were impossible to verify but strikingly consistent with one another. Others gave anonymous testimonies to researchers. They described procedures, locations, and events that matched details from other sources. The picture that emerged was of a program that had been running for decades, operating in the shadows, recovering objects and remains that challenged the basic assumptions of science and technology. One particularly detailed account came from a former military officer. He claimed to have taken part in a recovery operation in 1978. The site was in a remote area of the Sonoran Desert. It could only be reached by rough dirt roads. The object had crashed at night. It left a long trench in the sand. When the team arrived, they found a craft that was still partly whole. Though heavily damaged, the hull was torn open. It exposed an interior that seemed impossibly complex. Wires, or something like wires, ran through the structure in patterns that made no sense. There were no seats, no controls that looked familiar, just smooth surfaces and panels covered in symbols. The symbols looked like no known language. The officer described the feeling at the site as deeply unsettling. There were no bodies this time, but the team felt as though they were being watched. Equipment failed without explanation. Radios produced static. Compasses spun uselessly. One team member reported seeing movement in the darkness beyond the boundary, something that vanished when flashlights were aimed in its direction. The recovery was completed quickly. The wreckage was loaded and moved before dawn. Afterward, the team was debriefed. They were reminded of their secrecy oaths. The officer never learned what became of the material they recovered, but he remained convinced that it was not of human origin. The physical effects on recovery team members became a concern. Some reported strange health problems years after their involvement, unusual cancers, neurological disorders, memory problems. Whether these were related to exposure to unknown materials or radiation is unclear. The military denied any connection. Medical records were sealed or lost. Compensation claims were rejected. The message was clear. If you got sick from this work, you were on your own. The patterns in these health issues were disturbing. Multiple team members from the same operations developed similar conditions: brain tumors, immune system failures, skin conditions that doctors could not diagnose. One physician who treated several former team members noticed the pattern. He tried to publish a paper connecting the illnesses to their work. The paper was never published. He was visited by government officials who informed him that discussing his patient's work history would violate national security. The research disappeared. Some team members developed severe anxiety and depression, not just from the stress of the work, but from what they had seen, from the knowledge they carried. One former member described waking up in the middle of the night, haunted by the memory of a being's face, the large eyes, the expression that might have been fear or pain, or something humans do not have words for. He wondered if the being had family, if anyone mourned its death. These thoughts consumed him until he sought help, but the only therapists he could speak to were those cleared to hear such things, and their help came with reminders of his secrecy oath. There were also psychological effects. Several team members reported nightmares, visions of the beings they had seen. Some developed intense anxiety, others became obsessed with the work. They spent their retirement years trying to piece together what they had been part of. Some turned to alcohol, a few took their own lives. The toll of keeping such secrets, of knowing things the rest of humanity did not, proved too much for some to bear. The families left behind struggled to understand. Spouses found letters after their husbands died, partial confessions, attempts to explain without violating the oaths they had taken. Children discovered documents in storage units, photographs that made no sense, diagrams of objects that should not exist. These discoveries left families with more questions than answers. Some tried to investigate further. They contacted researchers, attended conferences, tried to piece together the fragments their loved ones had left behind. One widow described finding a journal her husband had kept. He had been part of a recovery team in the 1950s. The journal was written in a code only he understood. After his death, she spent years trying to decipher it. She eventually succeeded with help from a cryptographer. What she read left her shaken. Descriptions of objects that defied physics, of beings that communicated without speaking, of technology that seemed alive. Her husband had been carrying this knowledge for 40 years, never able to share it, never able to process it fully. She understood then why he had been distant, why he had trouble sleeping, why he had sometimes stared at the night sky with an expression she could not read. Skeptics have long argued that these stories are the result of misidentification, Cold War fear, the desire to believe in something strange. Weather balloons, experimental aircraft, and even ordinary debris have all been mistaken for alien technology. The military's obsession with secrecy during the Cold War only fueled guessing. It turned routine operations into conspiracy theories, but the sheer number of reports makes it hard to dismiss the events entirely. The consistency of the descriptions adds weight. The number of credible witnesses cannot be ignored. Something was happening in the deserts of the American Southwest. The government was going to great lengths to keep it hidden. In recent years, some of this secrecy has begun to lift. Declassified documents have confirmed that the military was indeed tracking unidentified aerial events. Recovery operations did occur. Though the nature of what was recovered remains officially unexplained, former officials have gone on record stating that materials with properties beyond known technology were collected and studied. In 2017, the existence of a Pentagon program dedicated to looking into UFOs was publicly admitted. The program was known as the Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. It had been running since 2007. Its findings included encounters with objects that showed capabilities far beyond current human technology. The program's existence raised new questions. If the government was willing to admit to studying UFOs, what else were they hiding? The released videos showed objects moving in ways that defied physics. Navy pilots described encounters with craft that had no visible means of propulsion, that could accelerate instantly, that could hover without making a sound. These were not weather balloons or experimental aircraft. They were something else entirely. Yet even with these admissions, the full truth remains hidden. Documents are still classified. Facilities remain off-limits. Personnel who might have first-hand knowledge are bound by secrecy agreements that extend beyond their lifetimes. The recovery teams, if they still operate, do so in complete silence. The desert, with its endless horizons and hidden valleys, keeps its secrets well. Those who have spent years researching this subject often describe a sense of frustration. Every lead seems to end in a locked door. Every witness either refuses to speak or has died. Every document is redacted to the point of being useless. But occasionally, a piece of the puzzle emerges. A deathbed confession, a leaked memo, a photograph taken decades ago and only recently discovered. These fragments suggest that the recovery operations were real, that objects and beings were collected, that the knowledge gained from them may have influenced human technology in ways the public will never fully understand. The technological leaps of the past 70 years are often cited as evidence. In 1947, computers filled entire rooms and could barely perform basic calculations. Today, we carry devices in our pockets more powerful than the machines that sent astronauts to the moon. Fiber optics, integrated circuits, Kevlar, night vision, stealth technology. All of these emerged in the decades following the first recovery operations. Some researchers believe these advances came from studying recovered materials. Others say this is coincidence, that human ingenuity alone drove these innovations. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. What remains unclear is the purpose behind these visits, if that is what they were. Were these craft exploring our planet, studying us as we might study an undiscovered species? Were they accidents? Technology pushed beyond its limits and failing at the worst possible moment? Or were they deliberate? A slow process of contact designed to avoid causing panic or disrupting human society? The recovery teams were never given answers to these questions. They were simply told to collect, secure, and remain silent. There are those who believe the crashes were not accidents at all, that they were gifts, technology left for us to find. A way to advance our civilization without direct interference. This theory suggests a benevolent intent, watchers from beyond who want to help but cannot reveal themselves. Others see it differently. They believe the crashes are the result of conflict, a war happening above our heads that we cannot see, between factions we do not understand, and sometimes the casualties of that war fall to earth. The most disturbing theory is that the objects are surveillance devices, drones sent to monitor our development, to track our progress, to assess whether we are a threat or an opportunity. Under this view, the crashes are not failures but deliberate, meant to seed our technology, to guide our advancement in specific directions, to prepare us for something yet to come. If this theory is correct, then every piece of recovered technology was meant to be found. Every craft that came down was allowed to come down. It would mean that our technological progress over the past 70 years has not been entirely our own, that we have been guided, nudged in certain directions, given pieces of a puzzle we do not yet understand, but that we are slowly learning to assemble. This raises uncomfortable questions about free will, about human achievement. Are our greatest innovations truly ours, or have we been following a path laid out for us? The scientists who claim to have worked on these projects describe moments of sudden insight, solutions that appeared fully formed, ideas that seemed to come from nowhere. They attributed it to genius, to inspiration. But what if it was something else? What if the technology itself was teaching them, communicating in ways they did not consciously recognize? There are accounts of researchers experiencing vivid dreams after working with recovered materials. Dreams filled with symbols and equations. Some dismissed these as their subconscious processing the day's work. Others were not so sure. They began keeping journals, documenting the dreams, comparing notes with colleagues. The patterns they found were disturbing. Multiple researchers having the same dreams, seeing the same symbols, arriving at the same conclusions through what appeared to be shared unconscious knowledge. One scientist described it as if the material itself was alive, not in a biological sense, but aware, responsive. It seemed to know when it was being studied, to reveal different properties based on who was examining it, or perhaps based on what it wanted to reveal. This description aligns with reports from recovery team members who handled fresh debris. Many reported feeling watched, not by people, but by the material itself. The desert remains the focal point of these activities. But why? Some believe it is simply practical. Remote locations, clear skies, military control over vast territories. But others suggest there is something about the desert itself. Ancient cultures considered these places sacred. thin spots where the barrier between worlds was weak, where spirits moved freely, where the impossible became possible. The Hopi people have legends about sky beings who came to teach their ancestors. The Navajo speak of star people who traveled between worlds. These stories predate modern UFO sightings by centuries. Were these early encounters with the same beings whose craft now fall from the sky? Or are they separate phenomena, coincidences of culture and mythology? Archaeological sites in the southwest show evidence of advanced astronomical knowledge. The Anasazi built structures aligned with celestial events. They tracked the movements of planets with precision that should not have been possible without telescopes. How did they acquire this knowledge? Some researchers suggest they were taught, that contact with non-human intelligence has been happening far longer than the modern era, that the recovery operations of the 20th century are merely the latest chapter in a much older story. The desert still holds its mysteries. Restricted zones still exist, fenced off and patrolled. Stories still spread among those who live near these areas, tales of lights in the sky, strange sounds in the night. Convoys moving through the darkness with no explanation. Whether the recovery teams are still out there, waiting for the next call, is something only a select few would know. But if history is any guide, the next time something falls from the sky, someone will be ready to make sure it disappears before the rest of us ever learn it was there. There are recent reports that suggest the activity has not stopped. In 2004, a rancher in rural Nevada reported finding unusual debris on his property. Before he could collect samples, military vehicles arrived. The area was sealed off. The debris was removed. He was told it was from a crashed drone, but the material he briefly handled did not look like anything from a drone. It was thin as paper but could not be torn. It had symbols etched into its surface, symbols he could not identify. The rancher, whose name was kept private, later described the response time as impossible. He had found the debris at dawn while checking his fence line. By mid-morning, before he had even called anyone, the military was already there. How did they know? He had told no one, made no calls, yet somehow they knew exactly where to go. When he asked the commander in charge, he was given no answer, just a stern look and a reminder that he had seen nothing, that the property was still under military jurisdiction, that he should forget the entire morning. His neighbors reported seeing helicopters throughout the day, black ones with no markings. They flew low over the valley in a grid pattern, as if searching for something, or perhaps making sure nothing else had fallen. The rancher's wife described hearing a strange hum the night before the debris appeared, a sound that made the windows rattle, that made their dogs hide under the porch. She had looked outside but saw nothing, just darkness and stars. But the hum continued for nearly an hour before finally stopping. In 2012, hikers in the Superstition Mountains of Arizona stumbled upon a crash site. The object had carved a path through the rocks. It left a trail of molten stone. By the time they reported it to authorities, the site had been cleaned, every trace removed. They were told they had found the remains of a meteorite impact. But meteorites do not leave perfectly circular indentations. They do not melt rock in straight lines. One of the hikers was a geology student. She knew what meteorite impacts looked like. This was not one. The stone had been melted in a way that suggested intense, focused heat, not the scattered pattern of a space rock burning through the atmosphere. She took photos before leaving the site. But when she returned to her car, her camera was gone. Someone had broken into the vehicle. Nothing else was taken. Not her wallet, not her laptop, just the camera. She filed a police report but never heard back. The other incidents that never made headlines are perhaps the most telling. In 1996, a commercial pilot flying over Death Valley reported seeing something fall from the sky. It was not a meteor. It moved too slowly. It changed direction mid-fall. He reported it to air traffic control. His report was logged. But when he landed and asked about it, he was told there was no record of his call. The log had been erased. He was advised to forget what he had seen, that his career would be better for it. In 2008, construction workers building a new highway through the Mojave Desert uncovered something buried beneath the sand. It was metallic, larger than a car, covered in a material that did not corrode, despite clearly being underground for decades. Work on the highway stopped immediately. Federal agents arrived within hours. The workers were sent home. When they returned the next day, the object was gone. The hole had been filled. The project continued as if nothing had happened. The foreman who asked questions was fired. The official reason given was budget cuts. Everyone knew better. These modern incidents follow the same pattern as those from decades ago: quick response, complete removal, official explanations that do not match the evidence. It suggests that whatever began in the 1940s has not ended. The recovery teams are still active, still responding to events the public never hears about, still collecting materials that challenge everything we think we know. The question that haunts researchers is simple. If this has been happening for over 70 years, how much have they collected? How many craft? How many beings? What have they learned from studying them? And perhaps most importantly, why is it still secret? Some argue that the truth would cause mass panic, that humanity is not ready to know we are not alone. Others believe it is about power, that the technology recovered gives those who control it an unimaginable advantage, an advantage they will never willingly share. The scale of the operation is staggering when you consider the logistics. Every recovery requires planning, transportation, storage, security, personnel. This is not a small operation run by a handful of people. It requires infrastructure, buildings, warehouses, laboratories, all hidden from public view, all operating under classifications so high that even members of Congress are denied access. Former Senator Barry Goldwater once tried to gain entry to a secure area at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. He was a senior member of the Armed Services Committee, a decorated Air Force pilot, a man with some of the highest security clearances in the government. He was turned away, told that even he did not have the clearance to see what was inside. He later said it was the only time in his career he had been denied access to a military facility. It left him convinced that something significant was being hidden. The money required to maintain such an operation must be enormous. Where does it come from? Black budgets, funds allocated to programs that do not officially exist, money that cannot be traced or audited. Some estimates place these black budgets in the billions of dollars annually, enough to fund entire research programs, to build underground facilities, to pay personnel who do not appear on any official roster. There are whispers of facilities that go deeper than anyone realizes. Not just underground storage, but entire complexes built into mountains beneath the desert floor. Some researchers claim there are levels beneath Area 51 that extend hundreds of feet down. Laboratories where recovered technology is studied, rooms where biological specimens are kept, all of it hidden from satellites, from prying eyes, from anyone without the proper clearance. The personnel who work in these places live double lives. They go home to their families, they attend barbecues and soccer games, but they cannot talk about their work, cannot share what they have seen. Some develop elaborate cover stories. They tell their spouses they work in accounting, in administration, in boring desk jobs that explain the long hours but reveal nothing of substance. The psychological toll of living this way, of carrying such secrets, cannot be understated. There are support systems in place for these workers, counselors with the highest clearances, support groups where they can speak freely, but only with others who know what they know, who have seen what they have seen. These networks create a kind of parallel society, people who exist in the normal world but are fundamentally separate from it, who know truths that the rest of humanity does not. Some of these workers have tried to leave, to walk away from the programs. But leaving is not simple. Exit interviews can last for days, psychological evaluations, polygraph tests, reminders of the legal consequences of disclosure. Some who have tried to speak out have found themselves facing prosecution. Others have simply disappeared from public view. Their warnings to others clear enough. There is also the possibility that the secrecy is not entirely our choice, that those who pilot these craft have made it clear they do not want their presence widely known, that they have the means to enforce that silence. This theory suggests a level of control that is terrifying to consider, that our governments are not the ones truly in charge, that decisions are being made by forces we cannot see or understand. Some researchers point to patterns in how information is released. Documents are declassified, but only decades after the events. Witnesses come forward, but only after they are old, and their credibility can be questioned. Videos are released, but they are grainy and inconclusive. It is as if there is a controlled release of information, enough to acknowledge that something is happening, but never enough to prove what it is. This could be careful management by human authorities, or it could be something else, a non-human intelligence that understands how to manage disclosure, how to slowly acclimate humanity to a truth it is not ready to accept all at once. The abduction phenomenon adds another layer to this mystery. Thousands of people have reported being taken aboard craft, examined, subjected to procedures they do not understand. Many of these accounts share common elements: medical examinations, samples taken, implants inserted. When these implants are removed and analyzed, they are found to be made of materials that should not exist, combinations of elements that do not occur naturally. That cannot be manufactured with known technology. Some abductees report being shown images, visions of the future, warnings about environmental collapse, nuclear war, ecological disaster. Are these genuine communications, attempts by non-human intelligence to steer humanity away from self-destruction? Or are they psychological projections, the brain trying to make sense of trauma it cannot process? The recovery teams have reportedly debriefed some of these individuals, trying to determine if their experiences connect to the crashed craft, to the beings recovered, to the larger picture of what is happening. There are also reports of living beings in custody, not just the one that died at White Sands, but others, kept in secure facilities, studied, communicated with. If true, this raises profound questions. Are they prisoners, guests, ambassadors? What agreements, if any, have been made? Some whistleblowers claim there are treaties, arrangements between human governments and non-human entities, agreements that allow limited abductions in exchange for technology, for knowledge. These claims are impossible to verify, but the consistency of the accounts, spread across decades and continents, is difficult to dismiss entirely. For now, the desert keeps its secrets. The recovery teams, if they exist, continue their work in silence. The objects, whatever they are, continue to appear and disappear, and the rest of us are left to wonder, to piece together fragments of stories, to look up at the night sky and ask questions that may never be answered. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the mystery itself is what keeps us searching, what keeps us looking up, what reminds us that for all our knowledge and technology, there is still so much we do not understand. If you found this account intriguing, let us know your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever witnessed something in the desert you could not explain? Subscribe for more explorations into the unknown. Remember, some questions may never have answers, but that does not mean we should stop asking them.